What happens when a police officer with a power complex meets a woman who outranks him in every way that truly matters? It was a late Wednesday night, just past 10 o'clock. The kind of hour when the streets of Toledo, Ohio are nearly empty, save for a few late shift workers heading home, or someone like Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Wallace, quietly driving through town after wrapping up a long and intense base operations meeting. She was heading south in a black government-issued SUV, tinted windows, standard interior, nothing flashy, just clean, discreet, and functional. Just like Adrienne herself. Composed, restrained, and silent as she drove, softly humming along to the steady rhythm of her tires against the asphalt. She wasn't speeding, she wasn't weaving, just thinking, half in the moment, half still processing the details from her meeting. But someone else saw something entirely different. Sergeant Daniel Mercer was parked off Reynolds Street, half reclined in his cruiser, sipping lukewarm coffee and scrolling mindlessly through his phone to pass the time. No calls had come through, no action tonight, just boredom and radio static. That is, until an unfamiliar black SUV glided past. Without hesitation, Mercer tossed his coffee cup onto the passenger seat, flipped on his lights, and pulled out, suspicion already clouding his thoughts. Adrienne saw the red and glue lights in her mirror. She didn't panic. She blinked once, calmly guided her vehicle to the curb, and came to a smooth stop, exactly the way she'd been trained. The patrol car door slammed shut behind her. She watched the officer approach in her side mirror. He was tall, square-shouldered, flashlight in one hand, the other resting on his utility belt. But instead of approaching the passenger side, standard protocol at night, he came straight to her window. "License and registration," he snapped. No greeting, no explanation. Adrienne lowered her window halfway and kept both hands in plain sight. "Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over?" Mercer narrowed his eyes and shined his flashlight directly into her face. "You were drifting between lanes, no signal. Might have been distracted. You been drinking?" Her brow lifted slightly. "No, sir." "License and registration," he repeated, louder now. Without protest, Adrienne reached slowly, deliberately into the glove compartment, retrieved her credentials, and handed them over. "This is a government vehicle," she added. "I'm a federal employee." Mercer glanced at her ID and paused for a beat. "Military, huh?" he smirked. "That doesn't mean you're above the law." "I never said I was," she replied calmly, her voice unwavering. But his tone sharpened, just enough to make the moment shift. "Step out of the car." Adrienne blinked. "Excuse me?" I said. "Step out of the car." Her jaw clenched, but her voice stayed even. "On what legal grounds, officer? I've complied with every request." "Now you're refusing a lawful order," he growled, stepping closer. "No, sir," Adrienne replied. "I'm asking for clarification." "That's not the same." Mercer didn't like that answer. Without another word, he reached for the door handle himself. That's when Adrienne calmly lifted her phone and tapped the screen. "For everyone's protection, this interaction is now being recorded," she said clearly. Mercer's eyes flicked to the phone for the first time, a flicker of something, hesitation, crossing his face. But he didn't retreat. And Adrienne didn't stay seated. She stepped out, not in defiance, not with aggression, but with quiet, unshakable authority. Even in plain clothes, something about her bearing told a different story. Mercer really looked at her now, and for the first time, a voice inside him whispered, "What exactly am I dealing with?" But ego is a loud thing, and his drowned out everything else. He ordered a field sobriety test. Under the dim glow of a streetlight, Adrienne walked the straight line. Heel to toe, smooth, controlled, not a single wobble or hesitation. She passed perfectly. Still, Mercer pulled out his ticket pad and began writing. "Failure to maintain lane discipline," he muttered as he handed it over. Adrienne accepted the citation without argument. Then, without another word, she returned to her car and disappeared into the darkness. Mercer watched her go, thinking the story ended there. But what he didn't know What he couldn't have known was that the story was only just beginning. That traffic ticket? It would show up again, this time in a federal courtroom, and it would unravel more than just his night. Sergeant Daniel Mercer had picked the wrong woman to try and intimidate. Mercer wasn't a rookie, and his face showed it. Years in uniform had carved wrinkles deep into his skin, but even deeper into his sense of self. He'd seen it all: violent street fights, messy traffic collisions, drunk drivers, and domestic disputes that went sideways fast. Through it all, he built a reputation that preceded him. New recruits tensed up when he walked into a room. And Mercer? He liked it that way. He didn't ask questions, he gave orders. To him, the badge was the final word, end of discussion. Whether it was a defiant teenager mouthing off or a driver asking too many questions, Mercer didn't back down. And he never apologized. At the West Side precinct of Toledo PD, everyone knew what they had in him: a paperwork machine who clocked in early, wrote fast, and didn't hesitate under pressure. But they also knew something else. Mercer could be abrasive, his temper flared fast, and his tone could turn sharp like a blade. Yet no one ever really challenged him. Not until that night. When he returned to the station after the stop, Mercer didn't even mention it. He logged it as routine: failure to maintain lane, driver exhibited diminished focus, no arrest. He tossed his body cam onto the charging dock like it was just another night. The footage sat there, untouched, unwatched, just like it always did. Meanwhile, Mercer joked about it in the break room. "She tried to flash rank at me," he laughed, cracking open a bag of chips. He was talking to Officer Diaz, chuckling as he mimicked her voice. "Gave me her fancy federal ID like it was supposed to impress me." Diaz tilted his head, intrigued. "Was she military?" Mercer shrugged. "Said something about logistics, had that vibe. You know the type." But when Mercer casually mentioned her last name, Wallace, Diaz's expression shifted. "Wait, Adrienne Wallace?" Mercer froze, chip in hand. "Yeah, why?" Diaz leaned forward, suddenly serious. "She gave a lecture at the academy last year. That's not just some soldier, that's Lieutenant Colonel Wallace, from Fort Wayne. 2 Bronze Stars, served overseas. She's the real deal." Mercer leaned back and waved it off, scoffing. "You care who she is. On the road, I'm the authority." But Diaz's tone, something quiet, reverent, put a tiny crack in Mercer's armor. He didn't say it out loud, but for the first time, Mercer wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd underestimated someone. Still, he didn't go back and watch the body cam footage. Didn't give that ticket another thought. In his mind, the whole thing was over, filed, closed, done. But he was wrong, because the next morning Adrienne Wallace filed a formal complaint. Not just with the precinct's internal affairs unit, but also with the Office of the Inspector General. And she wasn't alone. The video she had recorded on her own phone was already in the hands of her legal team, and a copy was quietly moving its way through the military chain of command, where Mercer's name meant nothing. Mercer, meanwhile, went back to business as usual, barking orders during minor traffic stops, yelling at people like always. Because for years, he'd operated under an unspoken rule: the system would protect him. His supervisors looked the other way. Union reps had crushed complaints before they could go public. And Mercer believed, truly believed, that the rules didn't apply to him the way they did to everyone else. But this time, someone pushed back. Not with shouting, not with threats, not with fists or fury. She simply followed protocol, pressed record, made a call, and sent a file to the right office with the right names attached. Mercer didn't see it coming. Not until a thick envelope landed on his desk, marked Official Investigation Notice. Adrienne Wallace wasn't someone who made noise just to be heard. She wasn't dramatic, she wasn't reckless. She didn't have time for petty injustices. Not after 2 combat deployments, decades of leadership, and more challenges than most could ever imagine. But this time was different. Because this time it wasn't just about her. It was about every young soldier she'd ever mentored. Every civilian she'd watched get mistreated while the world looked away. Every woman, especially every black woman, who had to swallow her pride just to stay safe. This wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Adrian thought not just of herself, but of every young soldier she'd ever mentored. Every civilian she had seen mistreated, those who never had anyone to speak for them. Every woman, especially every black woman, who had to swallow her pride just to avoid escalating a situation. And she refused to do that again. Back in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the next morning she sat in her office, barely having slept. She stared at her screen, her mind replaying the traffic stop in brutal detail. Not just the words, but the way he looked at her, like she was nothing. The way his hand hovered above his holster, like a subtle dare. The way he baited her, trying to draw out a reaction she refused to give. She knew the script. She knew exactly how quickly things could have spiraled out of control, even with a camera rolling. That knowledge alone was enough to keep her steady, to keep her voice level. Sergeant Daniels entered her office, poking his head in cautiously. Adrienne looked up, composed but razor-sharp. "I saw the footage," Daniels said, stepping inside and quietly closing the door behind him. "I think we need to loop in base legal. This isn't over." "Already done," Adrienne replied. Daniels paused, uncertain. "Are you sure you want to take this public?" Adrienne leaned back in her chair, her voice low but firm. "I'm not looking for headlines. I'm looking for accountability." She had spent her entire career earning her rank, not just wearing it. Every stripe and insignia represented years of decisions, risks, and responsibility. She had commanded convoys through hostile terrain, coordinated disaster relief after floods and hurricanes, managed supplies and secured operations across 4 continents. But none of that had mattered when she was stopped on a quiet road in Ohio. To Mercer, she wasn't a veteran or an officer, just another suspicious driver who didn't smile fast enough. And what unsettled her most wasn't just how he treated her. It was how comfortable he was doing it. That was the real threat. So Adrienne did what she had always done. She followed procedure. She called JAG, then filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General's office. She attached the video file, no edits, no narrative spin, just the truth, frame by frame. And she let that truth speak for itself. By the end of the week, the story was making quiet rounds among military legal teams. It hadn't reached the press yet, but Mercer's name was now attached to an official inquiry. The department's bar council had been notified. Adrienne, meanwhile, kept showing up for work, doing her job, saying nothing unless asked. But behind closed doors, she was preparing for the next step. Her attorney, Delaney Price, had reviewed the footage and made a clear suggestion. The stop wasn't just inappropriate, it might have violated federal policy. Given her status as a federal officer and the absence of probable cause, the traffic stop could be unlawful. "If this has to go to court," Price had said, "then we'll take it to court." Adrienne didn't flinch. She welcomed it. Mercer, however, still believed none of it would amount to anything. That is, until the envelope arrived. Plain, thin, manila, but official. His name printed on the front. Return address, Lucas County Civil Court. Mercer tore it open in the precinct parking lot, half distracted. He assumed it was another summons or a department memo. It wasn't. It was a formal court notice. A civil rights lawsuit filed by Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Wallace, alleging unlawful stop, abuse of authority, threatening behavior, violations of constitutional rights. Mercer stood in place, staring at the paper. Then he scoffed, laughed even. "No way," he muttered. "No way this sticks." But back inside the station, the tone had changed. His captain, Officer Dan Reading, called him into his office. Closed the door, drew the blinds. "We need to talk," Reading began. Mercer sat down with arms folded. "Let me guess. This is about the woman from the other night." "She's trying to play the victim," he added dismissively. But Reading didn't laugh. "She's not playing anything." "Do you even know who she is?" Reading asked. "I don't care who she is," Mercer snapped. "She was non-compliant and now she's angry. I didn't kiss her boots." Reading leaned forward. She's not just some driver. She's a lieutenant colonel, a decorated veteran. Her record is spotless. Her reputation runs deep. And we've got it all on tape. From both cameras, hers and yours. Mercer leaned back, scoffing. So what? We're supposed to roll over because she's got stripes? No, Reading replied calmly. But we also don't pretend like this is nothing. You're going to court, and if this explodes in the press, it's going to hurt all of us. But Mercer still clung to his arrogance. She wasn't even detained. I didn't lay a hand on her. I followed protocol. No, Reading corrected. You escalated. You treated her like a suspect before you knew who she was. Mercer bit his lip, no longer so sure. The court date was set for 3 weeks out. And as whispers circled locker rooms and hallways, Mercer could feel it, the shift. No one said it aloud, but the air had changed. He was no longer the alpha. He was bleeding, and the pack could smell it. Back at her base, Adrienne was preparing too, but in a different way. No press conferences, no demands for spotlight. She met quietly with her legal team, reviewing every second of footage. She documented everything, precisely, professionally. Her attorney, Delaney Price, looked across the table. Are you sure you want this to go public? Adrienne nodded. Let it. Price exhaled. Most people would let this go. I've let too much go, Adrienne replied. And this time, it's not just about me. She wasn't seeking compensation, she wanted documentation. Case, a precedent, a moment on record that said, power does not excuse behavior. Silence is not the only option. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for those who had been dismissed, disrespected, and silenced behind flashing lights and badges. When the court date arrived, Adrienne didn't sneak in. She entered in full uniform. Military ribbons, insignia, rank badge gleaming. She wanted the jury and the world to see exactly who she was. The woman sitting in that SUV that night was a human being. One who had served her country, upheld the law, and expected at the very least the same in return. When Adrian Wallace walked into the courtroom, Mercer was already seated. He turned in his chair, caught sight of her uniform, and for the first time the smug grin disappeared from his face. But the true challenge was only just beginning. When Adrienne stepped onto the witness stand, the room shifted. The courtroom wasn't packed with reporters yet, but it was full of officers, some from Toledo PD, others from Fort Wayne's military base. Her colleagues came quietly, respectfully, dressed in uniform or crisp civilian suits. They sat shoulder to shoulder with ordinary citizens, people who didn't know what this case was really about. To them it might have looked like a simple unlawful stop, but to Adrienne it was something deeper, a boiling point that had taken years to reach. Mercer sat at the defense table, stiff in a dark suit, jaw tight, eyes empty. His attorney, Charles Brenner, leaned in and whispered something to him. Mercer didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, waiting. Then Adrienne's name was called. She stood up slowly, adjusted her collar, and walked to the stand with the same silent authority she once used to lead military convoys through war zones. No hurry, no fear, only focus. Every eye in the room followed her. The ribbons on her chest caught the light. Her presence demanded respect, not because of her uniform, but because of who she was. The judge cleared his throat. Colonel Wallace, thank you for your service. You may proceed. Her attorney, Delaney Price, stepped forward without missing a beat. Lieutenant Colonel, can you describe what happened on the night of January 12th? Adrienne's voice was calm, steady. I was returning from a base meeting around 1:00 a.m. I was stopped by a Toledo police officer, Sergeant Mercer. I was not driving erratically. I showed no signs of impairment. I complied with instructions and asked reasonable questions. But his responses were aggressive and abrupt. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. He ordered me out of the car without stating a reason. When I asked why, he repeated the command, this time louder. So I turned on my phone and began recording. Did you ever disobey a lawful command? Price asked. No. Did you resist physically or verbally? Not at all. Did you identify yourself? Yes. I informed him I was a federal employee operating a government vehicle. The courtroom was silent. No coughs, no whispers, just her voice and the sound of pens scratching across legal pads. Then came the evidence. First, Adrienne's phone footage. Clear, still. Damn. Then Mercer's body cam showing everything. His tone, his stance, his hand hovering unnecessarily near his weapon. Even as she remained composed, cooperative, and calm. The field test, the attitude when she passed, the disdain on his face. The jury didn't speak, but they didn't have to. You could feel the shift in the room, like air sucked out of a vacuum. Then came the cross-examination. Brenner approached slowly, his tone calculated to sound polite, but every question cut deeper. Lieutenant Colonel Wallace, with all due respect, is it possible? Sergeant Mercer was simply following protocol. Adrienne didn't blink. Protocol is not shouting. Protocol is not intimidation. Did you appear to be a threat in any way? I was driving at a normal, safe speed. I posed no danger to myself or others. Then why record the interaction? Because I've lived long enough to know that silence isn't protection, Adrienne replied. I wanted an accurate record of what happened, nothing more. Rayner nodded slowly, carefully. So, you don't believe officers should have discretion during a traffic stop? Adrienne met his eyes. I believe discretion must come with the discipline of the badge. Authority is not a free pass, it is a responsibility. Even the judge paused before moving on. Then it was Mercer's turn. He didn't take the stand, he walked through the footage again. Paused, rewound, highlighted every unclear moment. Every look, every word, every reaction. Where did you order her out of the car? The prosecutor asked. She seemed evasive. Did she disobey your order? She asked if it was a legal order. Did she raise her voice? Mercer hesitated. No. Then what exactly made you escalate? He didn't answer. Sergeant Mercer, the prosecutor continued, did you know she was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army? No. And if you had known? Mercer looked down. His voice was barely audible. I might have handled it differently. That was the truth, or at least a piece of it. No remorse, just the admission of a lie told silently that night. Mercer hadn't seen a soldier. He hadn't seen a woman of honor, decorated and disciplined. He saw someone who didn't move fast enough. Someone who didn't speak the way he liked, having someone who didn't obey. She sat across from him, her rank clearly displayed. The courtroom could see it, but Adrienne didn't wear it for show. The trial wasn't over yet. Now the jury had to decide what accountability would actually look like. 3 days passed before a verdict was handed down. The courtroom was quieter this time. No uniforms, no observers from base or precinct. Just Adrienne, her lawyer, and a few civilians curious enough to witness the outcome. Mercer sat with his attorney, hands clasped, trying to maintain the blank expression he had worn all week. But his jaw moved slightly, like he was clenching his teeth without realizing it. Judge Cynthia Morales shuffled her notes, then looked up. In the matter of Wallace v. Mercer, she began, the jury finds in favor of the plaintiff. Adrienne remained still. Sergeant Mercer is found to have violated the plaintiff's constitutional rights during the unlawful stop and subsequent detainment. Furthermore, the court finds that Sergeant Mercer's actions were inconsistent with department policy and the basic standards of professional conduct. No one clapped. No one gasped. It wasn't that kind of victory. Mercer's attorney leaned in and whispered, "We'll appeal." But even he didn't sound sure anymore. The judge continued, while no criminal charges have been filed at this time, the plaintiff is awarded damages totaling $25,000. This ruling will remain part of the public record, and it will be forwarded to the Department of Justice and the Toledo Police Department for internal review. Adrienne didn't smile. She didn't raise her fist. She simply nodded once, not to the judge, not to the jury, but to herself. Same to do. Outside the courthouse, Mercer paced at the foot of the steps. A few local reporters had arrived, not a crowd, but enough. enough to make him lower his head and raise a file to shield his face as the cameras clicked. He gave no comment, just walked to his car and drove off. Inside, Adrienne stopped in the hallway, pulled out her phone, and read the verdict again. Her lawyer caught up with her. "You could have asked for more," he said. Adrienne shook her head. It was never about money. Delaney Price studied her for a moment. "You think this will change anything?" Adrienne turned. "I don't know. But maybe next time he pulls someone over, he'll think twice." A week later, Mercer was placed on administrative leave pending internal investigation. Some whispered he'd be reassigned. Others said this was the beginning of the end. Either way, the shield that had once protected him was cracked, and now everyone could see it. Back at Fort Wayne, Adrienne returned to duty as if nothing had happened. She didn't seek interviews. She didn't want headlines. She had a mission: soldiers to train, operations to lead, standards to uphold. But inside her unit, the message was clear. You don't always have to shout to demand respect. You don't have to break to prove you've been wrong. And sometimes the quietest act is the loudest form of resistance. Yet even with the verdict behind her, Adrienne knew the fight wasn't over. Because accountability isn't just about punishment, it's about what happens next. 2 months later, she stood in front of a room full of new recruits at Fort Wayne. Young faces, fresh uniforms, eyes wide with purpose. But she wasn't there to talk about strategy or logistics. She was there to talk about leadership, the kind no one sees. "How many of you think wearing this uniform automatically earns you respect?" she asked. A few hands went up, some timid, some proud. Adrienne nodded. "I get it. I used to think that too. But respect isn't something you're owed. It's something you earn every single day with every choice you make." A pause hung in the room like still air before a storm. Century Blue asked, "That badge, that rank, that authority?" she continued. "It's not a shield. It's a burden. And if you can't carry it with discipline, you don't deserve to carry it at all." One young soldier leaned forward, eyes locked on hers. Adrienne held the gaze, then added, "When I was stopped by that officer and he forgot who I was, I could have yelled. I could have panicked. I could have let it slide. I did none of those things. I recorded it. I reported it. I showed up in court, and I told the truth." The room fell into silence. But it wasn't the silence of boredom. It was the silence that happens when something lands. "That officer thought his badge made him untouchable," Adrienne said, "until he saw my rank, not just on my chest, but in my behavior. That's the difference." She closed the folder in front of her and looked up at the group. "Lead with service. Lead with integrity. And never forget, you don't just wear the uniform. You represent everyone who came before you, and everyone who will come after." She stepped off the podium, not for applause, not for thanks, but because the work was done. Let this story be a reminder. Power without responsibility is just a mask for weakness. Speak up. Stand firm. And when you witness injustice, don't look away. Because silence comforts the guilty, but courage protects the rest. Adrienne Wallace walked off the podium not because she sought praise, but because she understood what her role demanded. And as the courtroom doors closed behind her, a bigger truth lingered in the air, one that transcended laws, badges, and uniform. This was never just a story about a traffic stop gone wrong. It was about what happens when power meets principle, and what endures when one refuses to be silenced. As a story, Wallace v. Mercer plays out like a slow-burning courtroom drama, but with the depth and stillness of a character study. It's a confrontation between two very different worldviews, one shaped by entitlement, the other by responsibility. But beneath the legal jargon and procedural tension lies a far more intimate truth, one about family, legacy, and the invisible threads that tie us to something greater than ourselves. Adrienne never once mentioned her family during the trial. But every choice she made, every ounce of composure she carried, spoke volumes about how she was raised and what she believes in. You don't carry that kind of integrity without having witnessed it somewhere first. Maybe it came from a grandmother who taught her not to raise her voice to be heard, or a father who walked quietly but never bent his back to injustice. Maybe it came from watching a mother endure things with grace, because dignity was a legacy, not a privilege. Whatever the source, Adrian's conduct reflected one profound belief. Strength doesn't always shout. It often whispers, and still gets heard. And this is where the story stops being about courts and starts being about character. In a world where many are rewarded for noise, Adrian reminds us that restraint can be more powerful than rage. She could have escalated that night. She could have screamed, refused, and fought. But she didn't, because she believed in something greater than winning the moment. She believed in the long game. And that long game is built on values that begin in the home. Respect, decency, discipline, courage. These aren't rules you memorize, they're habits you absorb. Adrienne absorbed them so deeply that even under pressure, they surfaced naturally. The courtroom verdict validated her experience. But the real victory was in showing the next generation what quiet leadership looks like, especially to the young soldiers in Fort Wayne who watched her. Not just the uniform, but the woman inside it. Because the badge and the medals are symbols. What matters is how you carry them. And Adrienne carried hers with a clarity that echoed something bigger than her military title. It echoed a longing that many of us feel today. The need to believe in justice that is calm, unshaken, and deeply rooted in truth. The kind of justice that doesn't need a stage, only a conscience. And in that way, this story isn't just about what Mercer did, it's about what he failed to recognize. He saw a woman driving alone at night and assumed she was ordinary. But he didn't know her story. He didn't see the nights she spent in foreign deserts under enemy fire, or the lives she had protected with strategies no one will ever write about. He didn't see the family portraits on her office wall, the letters from soldiers who called her ma'am not out of obligation but out of gratitude. He didn't see the child she once was, taught to fear the world but never taught to cower. And most of all, he didn't see that she belonged to something bigger than any one badge. That's the mistake many people make with women like Adrienne. They confuse softness with weakness, stillness with surrender, until those women speak and the world realizes that grace was power all along. And what Adrienne did with that power? She protected more than herself. She carved a path for the ones who would come next. For every recruit who would one day face a badge in fear. For every civilian who has ever been told to stay quiet and comply. She gave them a model, not of perfection, but of preparedness. She taught us that we don't always need to scream to fight back. Sometimes, all it takes is pressing record and standing your ground. She made accountability visible. Not vengeful, not loud, just visible and undeniable. In doing so, she reminded us that truth is not just a value. It's a weapon when wielded with wisdom. So what can we learn from Adrienne Wallace? We learn that principle matters. That courage isn't always dramatic, it's sometimes deeply procedural. That power without humility is noise, but power with discipline is legacy. We learn that being right is not enough. You must act right even when no one else does. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all? That family values are not outdated, they are the very foundation of justice. Adrienne didn't quote her upbringing, but she embodied it. And through that embodiment, she showed us that personal character can move public systems. That it is still possible in this complicated world to be both humble and unshakable. And in an age of sensationalism, perhaps that is the most radical thing of all. Because stories like hers don't just make headlines. They make blueprints. For how to lead. For how to protect. For how to walk through injustice with your dignity intact. Adrienne Wallace didn't set out to become a symbol. She simply refused to become a statistic. And in doing so, she changed more than one man's future. She reshaped how we think about justice, leadership, and grace. Not with outrage, but with truth. Not through retaliation, but through action. And in the end, maybe that's what we need most in this world. Less noise, more purpose. Less spectacle, more substance. Fewer demands for attention and more quiet revolutions. Revolutions that begin with people like Adrienne and remind us, no matter where we come from, silence is not always peace and power is not always right. But truth spoken with strength and steadiness will always find its way to the light, even if it begins with a camera, on a quiet road, in the hands of a woman who simply refused to be less than what she was.